I actually started a new document, so it would be lighter. 115 slides, it starts getting slow. Pleasure to see all of you this morning. Hope you're doing well. I'd like to mention one thing before we begin our overview of our reading. Just this past week we had, I had some of these pamphlets reprinted that, no, I'm sorry. I did have some pamphlets reprinted, not this one. But I actually was able to get these, which are the 3 sermons that Brother Bill Hall preached. And he's preached them several places, but they are on the restudying of the issues of the 50s and 60s, kitchens, recreational centers, then the orphans' home question, and then the sponsoring church with the Herald of Truth and other things. But anyway, I picked up about 30 of them, and I wanted to give out some to our church history class the other night, because he deals with a lot of stuff that the last chapter of the book Brother Hedrick wrote deals with. But I've got some. If you don't have one, I really encourage you to get it. It's Brother Hall's lessons are an easy read, they're a fast read, and a good read. And anyway, I've got some up here at the front if you'd like some. Most of you may already have these, but we did pick up some extras, and keep that in mind. I just think they're excellent. I remember Brother R.J. Stevens made a comment, but he felt like that, and he went through the institutional problems of the 50s, and he said he felt like Brother Hall did the fairest job of anybody he'd ever read on it. That he was fair, he pointed out, some weaknesses and strengths, but anyway, I wanted you to know about that. In our readings this morning, we are in 2 Thessalonians and 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus and Philemon. So real briefly, we talked about 1 Thessalonians Wednesday night. Wednesday night seems like it was a year ago to me for whatever reason. But Paul was at Thessalonica in the 17th chapter of Acts on the second journey. And if you go back there was tremendous persecution. Jason's house, you might remember, was assaulted, and Jews stirred up all kinds of problems. The letter was written back on the second journey, the Thessalonian letter was written from Corinth in chapter 18, when Paul was there for about a year and a half. And the main point of 1 Thessalonians is, at the end of each chapter, he deals with the second coming of Christ. And so you keep that in mind as you continue to endure persecutions. You're being faithful among great odds, but keep going, because the Lord's going to come. Well, in the second letter, which was written evidently not too long after that, they had another problem. And the problem was evidently that they were so concerned about the coming of the Lord that they thought it must have been just imminent. And so he says in chapter 1, I want you to know that even the persecution that's coming on you, God is just, and to those who afflict you, affliction is coming. And all of you've heard 7 through 9, at the revelation of Jesus Christ from heaven with the angels of his power, in flaming fire, rendering vengeance on them that know not God and that obey not the gospel of his Son Jesus Christ, who shall suffer punishment, even eternal destruction, from the face of the Lord and the glory of his might. They're going to suffer, those people who are persecuting you. But in chapter 2 it says there's got to be something that comes first before the Lord comes, a falling away. And then in chapter 3, he encourages them to continue to do what? That evidently they had stopped doing. Working. Yeah, if a man doesn't work, neither should he eat. And so evidently they had just kind of stopped the presses, so to speak, and were doing that. So that's 2 Thessalonians. All right, the next book is what? 1 Timothy. First Timothy is about special relationships within the church. It's interesting, First and Second Timothy and Titus were written to evangelists. And I've told a lot of people that it's really a preacher's manual in a sense, primarily to encourage in with Timothy the various relations. If you find a book that has a passage that says this is the reason I'm writing, you can take that to the bank. And you have that in 1 Timothy 3:15. These things write unto you, hoping to come unto you shortly. But if I tarry long, that you might know how men ought to behave themselves in the house of God, which is the church of the living God, the pillar and what? The ground of the truth. That's right. So in chapter 1, there are a number of charges concerning doctrinal matters to make sure. He had charged them in times past, and he's charging Timothy to war the good warfare. And then in chapter 2, what relationships does he deal with? Everybody knows this now. 1 Timothy 2. Prayer in every place for leadership in government. And then he says in a similar way, in like manner, and then he deals with what group of people in the church? Women, right. And so he deals with them. Chapter 3, the relation with elders and even deacons and their qualifications. In 4, after he warns them about how some would fall away, he then starts really with the instruction dealing with what makes a good what? Verse 6. A good preacher. Yeah, if you would be a good minister, if you put the brethren in mind of these things, thou shalt be a good minister, nourished in the words of the faith and of the good doctrine. And so he talks about what a good preacher is, really, in those passages. And I remember hearing Brother Hedrick use verse 16 so often. Take heed to thyself and to thy teaching. Your behavior, make sure you behave like a Christian ought to behave. And then you be careful about what you teach. Continue in these things, for in so doing, you'll save two categories of people. First, what? Yourself, and then those who hear you. That's a tremendous passage. In chapter 5, the first 16 verses deal with widows who are widows indeed, whom the church could help, and then widows who are what? Busybodies. Widows that the church is not to help. Yeah, the family is to help. And then in 17 through the end, you have elders and prospective elders. Let the elders that rule well be counted worthy of double honor, especially them that labor in the word and in teaching. I take that to be elders who would also be preachers among them, the labor in the word and in doctrine. And then he gives information about that. Chapter 6, he continues with various relationships in 6, 1 through 2. What are they? The master-servant relationship. And then he goes back to the idea of the exhortation to godliness, and don't let godliness be just an outward form, but you be true. Godliness with contentment is great gain, verse 6. And then the final admonitions to fight the good warfare. Flee, follow, and fight, verse 11 and 12. And then the last charge in verse 17, those who are what? Rich. There are special difficulties that can come with those who are rich. And basically he says, don't let your riches go to your head, but make sure that you're rich in good works and you do what is good. So that's 1 Timothy. Real quickly, 2 Timothy. There's a phrase that I think, or a word at least, that is used so much in 2 Timothy. It's the word doctrine. And in chapter 1, hold to the doctrine. Hold the pattern of sound words, 1:13. In chapter 2, verse 1 and 2, what are they to do relative to sound doctrine? Teach it. In chapter 3, you could almost go down to verse 14, what are you to do relative to sound doctrine? Abide in it. And then in chapter 4, verse 2, you're to preach it. And I think that can almost summarize the ideas in 2 Timothy relative to sound doctrine. 2 Timothy is unique in it's the last what? The last epistle Paul wrote. His time was at hand. His departure was nigh. And he had this great optimism of being with the Lord. And then Titus, Paul left Titus in Crete, chapter 1, verse 5, that he might set in order the things that are wanting and appoint what? Elders in every city. And so the Crete was a what? An island. And so he, evidently this was after the first imprisonment. We can reconstruct some things that are stated in 1 Timothy as well as 2 Timothy and Titus. That Paul evidently made another journey. He went to Ephesus, went to Corinth. I left Trophimus at Miletus sick, and you can put all those things together. He made another journey, but he went to Crete, and there were difficulties on the Isle of Crete. Evidently, there were, verse 10, vain talkers, deceivers, especially those of the circumcision. But he told them that Titus needed to appoint elders. And then he gives what relative to elders? All the qualifications, yes. And then in chapter 2, again, the various relationships. Who does he address in verse 2? Well, speak thou the things which befit the sound doctrine that, who? Aged men. All right, then verse 3. Aged women to teach younger women. And then down in verse 9 and 10, servants, masters. Then in 11 through 15, he deals with the fact that the grace of God has appeared, bringing salvation, and what that should encourage us to do. In chapter 3, who does he address? Or about whom does he mention? Verse 3 verse 1. Rulers, authorities, and so on. And then those who are down toward the end of the paragraph, those who are engaged in foolish questions, genealogies, and strifes, and who are factious about these things, he ought to be what? What does he say? End of verse 10.
Nothing. Don't have anything to do with it.
Don't have anything? Yeah, avoid it. Avoid it, yes. All right, and then let's see, we did finish, yeah, we did. Titus, and then Philemon is about, who was, well, Philemon is about another man, actually, Onesimus. And Onesimus had been a what to Philemon? A slave, a servant to Philemon. And so what had happened? He ran away. And he met Paul, evidently, in Rome. And what happened to Onesimus? Paul converted him. He became a Christian. And so now he's telling Onesimus, and he's telling Philemon, I've sent Onesimus back to you, and I want you to do what? I want you to receive him not just a servant, but much more as a brother in the Lord. And if he'd taken anything, done anything wrong, who was going to pay for it? Paul. But he said, you really, there's kind of an underhanded way of Paul going back, but you owe your soul to me. You need to take him back. You need to do things the right way here. Okay, enough on that, and that carries us through our reading for today. We are in Matthew 6 in our study of the Sermon on the Mount, and we won't remember in the 5th chapter. Well, in a sense, the whole sermon deals with the constitution for what he has been saying is at hand. What is that? The kingdom. The kingdom of heaven is at hand. And so we have the qualities of citizenship in the kingdom and the Beatitudes. Now, let's go real quickly. Blessed are the poor in spirit, the second one. Those who are mourning over their sins, then they are meek, and then they hunger and thirst after righteousness. They are merciful to others, pure in heart, and peacemakers, and they're willing to be persecuted for righteousness' sake. Then in 13 through 16, he says, you are the salt of the earth, the light of the world. 17 through 20, Christ's relation to the law, right, Landon? And really ours. And then really the transition into the rest of the sermon is in 20. All of you can quote that. Verily, verily, I say unto you, except your righteousness exceed the righteousness of the scribes and Pharisees, you shall in no wise enter the kingdom of heaven. So, 21 through 26. Don't murder versus don't be angry. In fact, try to reconcile how quickly. 27 through 30, you've heard it said, don't commit adultery. I say don't look to lust. 31, 32, you can divorce, but give her a certificate of divorce versus divorce. If you divorce only for fornication. 33 through 37, you've heard it said, thou shalt not swear falsely. I say, don't swear at all. 38 through 42, you've heard it said, eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, but I say basically don't retaliate. Resist not him that's evil. Don't retaliate. Then 43 through the end, you've heard it said, thou shalt love thy neighbor and hate your enemy, but I say love your enemies and do them good, and those that curse you, you're blessed. All right, so now in chapter 6, what we've been talking about in 5 are these attitudes as well as actions, behavior. And now in 6, primarily the motives for doing what is right. And keep 5:20 as the backdrop. We talked Wednesday night somewhat about the overall idea here. In chapter 6, there are two major divisions. The first 18 verses deal with the motives for righteousness, motives for doing right. Then 19 through the end, you could probably summarize by using Jesus' words. Lay not up for yourselves treasures on earth, but treasures in heaven. And so in these first 18 verses, he has three areas that he specifies that the Jews were particular in and were elements of showing their piety. But the problem was, it was right to give, to be charitable. It was right to pray. It was right to fast. But the bottom line of all this was they were doing it why? To be seen of men. And so Jesus attacks the motives on all of this. He has exposed the corrupt misinterpretations, has given right applications of kingdom righteousness. Remember, disciples' righteousness had to exceed that of the scribes and Pharisees. And these three right activities in which self-righteousness and hypocrisy manifested itself, Jesus deals with. These were three principal manifestations of practical piety among the Jews, and were abused by the Pharisees to exhibit their own superior, and that is questionable, the superior piety. And each, Jesus emphasizes the common denominators. We went over this Wednesday night. But these are phrases that are repeated. You'll see, don't be as the hypocrites who do this, who give their alms, who sound the trumpet, and all this, and to be seen of men. They receive the glory of men. They receive their reward. Rather, you do what you do relative to these areas in secret, and your Father who sees in secret shall recompense you. And then this is the last chart we used Wednesday night. Jesus obviously does not prohibit publicizing good done by others, because we see evidence of the fact that good was publicized by inspired writers. They recorded acts of individuals as well as churches in areas of benevolence. The second chapter of Acts, we're going to come back to this in a moment, but in 4:32 through about 34, you have the general benevolence of the early church. But then you have a particular man who is emphasized in the end of 4, who had a certain field, sold it, brought the proceeds laid at the apostles' feet. Of whom do we speak? Barnabas, yeah. So but then in chapter 5, and I'll make this point on another slide, it's interesting that you have at the end of 4 and the beginning of 5 of the book of Acts, the very thing Jesus is talking about in Matthew 6. You know, don't do it to be seen of men, but do it with, that's what you have, with Barnabas. He was just doing it because people needed help. And then Ananias and Sapphira have a certain field. They sell it, but they did what? They kept back. They held back a part of it and evidently wanted the notoriety that Barnabas had. And in so doing, they lied about it and died. They lied and died. Okay, so we find that the church at Antioch gave to the brethren in Judea. There were occasions of prayer. We mentioned Paul, the early church, in fasting. In fastings often, Paul said. And then when the appointment of elders was going on in various cities. So it's not a case of another's knowledge that a person is benevolent, prays, or fasts that Jesus condemns, or even someone stating it about another. But it's the desiring one to do these things for their publicity. So Jesus hits at the heart of each of us and says, you've got to have a genuine desire just to help somebody and completely divorce it from any kind of look at me. The same could be said for any other activity or service rendered to God or individuals either in or outside the assembly. If we talk about that. This is not the last time Jesus will condemn such selfish motives. Let's all turn real briefly. In Matthew 23, we are in the last week of Jesus' life. And he's been in some heated debates with these Pharisees and Sadducees, and the disciples are listening. And so you'll notice in 23:1, then spoke Jesus to the multitudes and to his disciples, saying, scribes and Pharisees sit on Moses' seat, and all things therefore they bid you, these do and observe, but don't do after their works, because they say and do not. And notice verse 5. Randy, if you would read that all, verse 5.
And all their works they do for to be seen of men, and make broad their
Phylacteries?
and enlarge the borders of their garments.
Yes, and then he goes some more, verses 6 and 7, the chief places and so on. But the point is that this is not the last time Jesus is going to condemn these people for doing what actually is right, but we would say for the wrong what? The wrong reason. And then here's what I mentioned just a moment ago. For an inspired example of a contrast in motives behind benevolence, 4:32 through 37 with Joseph, whom the apostles surnamed Barnabas. And then you have, from everything he's said about Barnabas, he's true blue. But then with everything said about Ananias and Sapphira, what? They're not. And they were lying to the apostles and all of that. So we come back now to doing right for the right reasons. Let's read the first 4 verses. Lee, if you would, 6, 1 through 4.
Take heed that you do not do your charitable deeds before men to be seen by them. Otherwise you have no reward from your Father in heaven. Therefore, when you do a charitable deed, do not sound the trumpet before you as the hypocrites do in the synagogues and in the streets, that they may have glory from men. Assuredly, I say to you, they have their reward. But when you do a charitable deed, do not let your left hand know what your right hand is doing, that your charitable deed may be in secret, and your Father who sees in secret will himself reward you openly.
Okay, thank you. In verse 1, take heed, beware. That is, think carefully. Don't let all this get away from you and just kind of push it out. Take heed is a very serious charge. That you do not your righteousness, the American Standard has. Some other translations have what? Your charitable deeds, the New King James. What does the English Standard have on that?
This is righteousness.
Your righteousness. Yeah, the word righteousness is supported by the 2 different words by more of the ancient authorities, but do not your righteousness, and then the alms or charitable deeds specified in verse 2. So really verse 1 is almost like an introduction to the next 17 verses. Don't do what you do that's right in order to be what? Seen of men. Else you have no reward with your Father who is in heaven. In fact, Jesus will go on to say in the specifics that when they do what they do in order to be seen of men, and then they are seen of men, guess what? They have received their reward. You've got exactly what you're looking for, but you don't have it. I used to hear the idea or the phrase rather, and I don't hear it very much anymore, that so-and-so, because of the way somebody lived, his prayer wouldn't go any higher than the ceiling. Have y'all ever heard that phrase? It wouldn't go any higher than the ceiling. And it's just, and I'm also reminded, and this is with the prayer in verse 5 and following here, in Luke 18, the two men went to the temple to pray, one a Pharisee, the other publican. And the Pharisee prayed thus with himself. Not to God, but with himself. And then he was thankful for things he didn't do, and he was thankful for things he did. He did, fast twice a week and so on. But that's the common denominator in verse 1. And then in verse 2, when you do your alms, don't sound a trumpet. Likely not physically doing that, though there is some evidence that Hindus have done it. I was reading somebody earlier where they said there's a possibility that the Pharisees did that, literally. But we have a phrase that we use in English. Somebody's tooting his what? His own horn. Yeah. Look at me. Yeah, look at me. That they may have glory of men. The end of verse 2. Verily I say unto you, they have received their reward. But when you do your alms, let not your left hand know what your right hand does, that your alms may be in secret, and your Father who sees in secret shall recompense thee. I've got a couple of things on this that I may share with you here. You'll look up with me. The trumpets were blown as signals to large groups, which gave trumpets a symbolic significance. Anything noise abroad was trumpeted. Likely this was not literally done any more than today, but methods were used then and now to blow one little horn. Now, note also, he mentions two places. They love to sound the trumpet in the synagogues and in the streets, two different places. Evidently, they want not only their religious buddies to see them, but people who are just casual bystanders. Everybody they want to see. Some likely among religious as well as non-religious people. Same ideas relative to prayer. They love to stand and pray in the synagogues and in the corners of the streets, that they be seen of men.
No,
Yes, sir.
there were obviously people that observed giving from the story of the widow's mite.
Yes. So the point is, it's not wrong to know about that. It's just a matter of that's not the motive. Yep, good. Brother Bowles had an interesting comment, I thought. Let not your left hand know what your right hand does. Suggests a man passing one who is in need, and with his right hand giving alms in so quiet a way that even his own left hand does not know what's going on. Can't you just imagine somebody's going by and they see a beggar standing there or sitting there, and he just reaches in, he has a denarii or something, and this hand, he doesn't come over and it doesn't make any kind of a big deal about it. It's just, and I couldn't help but think in studying this years ago. When you're young and married, you got a kid, you usually could use a little extra money. And there was a brother that came up to me, and he shook my hand, and I felt something besides his palm. It was a $20 bill, and he just and I felt it. I said, "Oh, you don't need to do that." Oh, is that doing what Jesus is saying? Yeah, it's just not. You just put it where somebody, nobody else can see it. You're just trying to be helpful. and you try to keep it on the, we sometimes say on the down low. You just keep it where it's not a big deal. And then I also quoted from Brother Earnhardt. I thought he did a good job on this. He quoted from Chrysostom. You may do good deeds before men, and yet seek not human praise. You may do them in secret, and yet in your heart wish that they may become known to gain that praise. And then Brother Earnhardt mentioned it is for this reason. Jesus gives a second charge. Don't even announce it to yourself. Our giving must be wholly unself-conscious, without any thought of some credit which will accrue to our account with others. Not to keep the account, God will do that. I just thought that was extremely well stated. That, just, well, I've been a pretty good guy. I've done this. I kind of remind myself of how good I am. And that's exactly what Jesus says. You don't need to do that. Don't let your left hand know what your right hand does. Now, does that mean that if somebody knows about our being benevolent to another person and says it, well, then that's a problem? Again, the condemnation is on people, individual disciples, whose motive is what? His motive to be seen when he does it. Now, we've already noted that in Acts 2, Acts 4, Acts 11, even in the epistles of Romans 15, there Paul dealt with numbers of brethren who were benevolent, churches that were benevolent, commended them. There's no problem about that. The motive is what is being attacked here. The motive of wanting to do what is right insofar as the benevolence is concerned, in order to be seen, in order to be known as, what's the word? Being a philanthropist. Here, they just know about it. Calling a press conference. I think that's, most of these press conferences that are called are about me, aren't they? That's what I want to tell everybody about that. And I tell you what, I've got a Facebook account, but it was primarily for some other reasons. But I tell you what, I think that's, people, it's almost addictive if somebody likes, and I get this bill, hi, I'm a pretty good guy. And just people need to be careful about that. And comment, question? Okay. Brother Charlie, you look like, okay. Anyone? Okay, so prayer. Anybody else on the benevolence? All right, let's read the passages on prayer first, and we'll wrong slide here. Okay, we'll come back to prayer in this sense. Brother Charlie, why don't you read the whole paragraph, 5 through 15, please.
When you pray, you are not to be like the hypocrites, for they love to stand and pray in the synagogues and on the street corners, so that they may be seen of men. Truly I say to you, they have their reward in full. But you, when you pray, go into your inner room, close the door, and pray to your Father who is in secret. And your Father who sees what is done in secret will reward you. But when you are praying, do not use meaningless repetition, as the Gentiles do, for they suppose that they may be heard for their many words. So do not be like them. For your Father knows what you need before you ask Him. Pray then in this way. Our Father who is in heaven, hallowed be your name. Your kingdom come, your will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our debts, as we have also forgiven our debtors. Do not lead us into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For yours is the kingdom, the power, and the glory forever. Amen. For if you forgive others for their transgressions, your heavenly Father will also forgive you. But if you do not forgive others, then your Father will not forgive your transgressions.
All right. The prayer actually ends in 13, and a type of an explanation about the need for forgiveness of God, but showing that God's forgiveness is based somewhat on our attitude to forgive who? The others who have sinned against us. All right. So let's look at it for a moment here. Don't be, he says, like the hypocrites. They love to stand and pray in the synagogues and in the corners of the streets, that they may be seen of men. Again, Jesus does not condemn public prayer, but rather the use of public places for private devotions and those to be seen of men. He's not saying that they're public prayer. Jesus and the apostles engaged in public prayer during his ministry. And the early church, Acts 2:42, they continued steadfastly in the apostles' doctrine, fellowship, breaking of bread, and prayers. So we know all of that was going on. But it's the fact of taking your private, what should be privately done, and making a scene out of it in a public way. Jesus also noted the length of their prayers for notoriety. Notice verse 7. And in praying, use not vain repetitions as the Gentiles do, for they think that they shall be heard for their much speaking, or long prayers. And so he compared these long prayers that they would do in a public setting, a public forum, to the Gentiles praying to their pagan gods, and saying that, that they, I was reading, that the idea of these long pagan prayers, Baal, the prophets of Baal back in 1 Kings, basically all day. And then you think in Acts 19 with the Ephesians, when Paul was there he was going to go into the theater in Acts 19 in Ephesus, and his friends dissuaded him from doing that. And then all of them said for about the space of how many hours? Great is Diana of the Ephesians. 3 hours. 3 hours. Great is, can't you just imagine a mob? Great is Diana of the Ephesians. So they're doing all of that, and Jesus simply just knows, don't be like the Gentiles do. They think they will be heard for their long prayers. Jesus noted that. And I wanted to go to these passages here to show, he doesn't specifically go into detail here, but he does in the other passages. Matthew 23, let's go back to that passage. Whoever has verse 14, read it for us. Some of your translations, it may be in a marginal reading and not in the text, but that's okay. It's stated in other places. Whoever has it, verse 14.
Woe to you, scribes, Pharisees, and hypocrites! Though you devour widow's houses, for a pretense you make long prayers. Therefore you will see greater condemnation.
Yeah, you make long prayers for what? That P word? For pretense. And what's another translation of that? Pretense would be, we think, pretentious, or again, just for they're fake. They're for show. And the other passages, Mark 12:40 and Luke 20, deal with the same thing that we find here in Matthew 23, verse 14. So he noted, don't feel like you've got to have these long, extended prayers in order for God to hear you. And then he gives a reason. For the Father, what? He knows what things you have need of before you even ask. So, I digressed a moment ago. I was reading earlier about how, you think about the pagans, especially the Greek gods, and those who would worship them. The gods of the pagans were, for the most part, a type of wrath. They were wrathful gods. And even the idea of propitiation, which, this Greek word that Paul uses, is never something that a Christian brings to God, but it's what God has done for himself through Christ. But it was used among the Greeks of what the worshiper would try to bring to their God, the Greek pagan gods, in order to pacify his wrath. And so to pacify the wrath is the idea of propitiate. So I say all that to say that the idea of these pagan gods was, you're begging, more begging, hoping that their wrath will not come. And Jesus says God's not like that. You don't have to continually ask, and just the longer you go, maybe the more he'll listen. He knows these things before you ask. And so then he gives the model here in just a moment But when you pray, enter your closet. That is in verse, where are we? Verse 8, don't be like them. Your Father knows what things you have need of before you ask. So then the simplicity, after this manner, pray ye, and then our Father who is in heaven. And there's a simplicity, a brevity to all of this that Jesus emphasizes in the prayer.
He says in 6, he said, go in a room, shut the door,
Yeah.
so nobody see what you're doing.
Yes, exactly right. I've thought about this. Jesus' private prayers were sometimes extremely long, but he's by himself. In Mark 1, a long time before day. Luke 6, verse 12, before he chose the 12, all night. But these were by himself during these times. And Jesus gives the reason as to why long prayers are unnecessary. For your Father knows what things you have need of before you ask him. And then I quoted McGarvey, God does not need elaborate explanations, and prayer is not uttered to inform him, but to put ourselves in such communion with him as to make us fit to receive. Moreover, prayer is a matter of asking and receiving, not a meritorious service, as Mohammedans and Catholics still hold, and as the Pharisees held. So, putting all that together, we understand our need, our dependency on God, and prayer then is our communication with God. I was asked, when I was teaching ninth graders a number of times, I was asked by several who were really good people, good young people, if the Lord wants us to go to him in prayer, and yet this passage teaches he knows what we need before we ask, then the related question is why ask? Why ask? Well, it's not to inform. It's not to plead with a wrathful God who is wanting to hold back and not bless us. That's not it at all. But it's for us to see our dependency on him. I made the point, and I would try to tell folks that I've had young people, if you can read your Bible every day, that's God speaking to you, and you know where that's going. And you need to pray to God every day because that's your speaking to him. So you have the two lines of communication going every day. God speaking to you through our reading of his word, our speaking to him in prayer. And while we have public prayers, public prayers ought to be the least amount of praying that we do. The most praying we ought to do should be by ourselves, in the home, in the car, when we're walking, when we're maybe out in the woods, doing something else that we're by ourselves and we can talk to God and pour our hearts out to him. And I've told this in training classes before. I think private prayer helps us to get over any kind of nervousness of praying publicly. A lot of people, young men particularly, who obey the gospel, are somewhat reluctant to voice to lead a public prayer, and I understand that. But I think one of the answers to getting over that is just pray a lot on your own, and you get used to talking to God. And because one thing, you're not talking to everybody else; you're talking to God. Now, in public, there's a difference between our public prayers in that we're trying to include everyone else in our prayers. But still, while we're trying to include everybody, we've got to remember we're not praying to the public. We're not praying to the audience. We're praying with the audience, for the audience, to God. And that helps me tremendously. Where you just really don't even think about it. At least I don't. You just think you kind of visualize God and Christ on God's throne. And prayer is a very humbling thing, in my estimate. if we consider that we have audience with the creator of the universe. I may have told you, I met Coach Bryant in 1977. I think I was tongue-tied. I didn't know what to say. And when you meet somebody you've esteemed, you've seen them from afar, and you're right there, well, you just can't, I couldn't get it. Yes, sir, yes, sir. Good to meet you, sir. But can you imagine? I'm talking to the creator of the universe. It's a humbling thing, and we need, I think, the reverence that the Lord says, pray after this manner, our Father who art in heaven, then what's next? Hallowed, separate, the hagios is a Greek term, sanctified. You are separate from all other beings. And when we talk with God, we need to consider that. Somebody had a hand up. Was it you, Janet? Farron, I'm sorry.
In 1 Thessalonians, we went over earlier, chapter 5, verse 17, it says, pray without ceasing.
Yes, yes. And so that means prayer ought to be a big part of our private lives.
We should forever be in communion with God.
Yeah.
When we're not with other people.
Yeah, and I think we do that on a regular basis. As I mentioned, turn off the radio in the car and talk to God. Yes, sir.
It's hard to allow sin to come in
Yes,
if you're praying to God.
yes, that's exactly
And
right.
the more we do it, the more we push sin away.
Yes, that's exactly right. That's a good point. Yes, Patty?
I was just gonna say, any relationship is sustained with communication.
Yes.
When the communication fails, the relationship fails.
Yes,
We can understand that with children, with a marriage, with somebody you're dating,
Yeah.
with friends.
yes,
And so that is one of the means of communication to God. So when we think about that, when I think about that personally,
Yes.
if I'm not taking the time to speak and talk to my Father, then my relationship with Him has some flaw somewhere. in
yes,
there.
yes, there are other problems.
Yeah, the absence of communication equals no relationship.
Exactly. Great point. Anybody else? Our time is shot. Lord willing, we'll pick up here Wednesday night, go on with, end up with the prayer. The model prayer has some just wonderful, simple ideas in it, and then fasting. Okay, we'll stop.